Southwest Kansas. Some irrigation wells out here no longer pump enough water to run a center pivot because the ground underneath them has dropped that far, that fast. Meanwhile, the well next door, same aquifer, same emergency, is still legally allowed to pump at full permitted rate every single day. Kansas has decades of its own data showing this collapse happening in real time. The state is not confused about what is happening to the Ogallala. It is documenting its own math problem. And the explanation officials give, the one that sounds reasonable, is actually the reason nothing ever changes. I work with groundwater systems for a living, and I want to say something up front that's going to sound strange coming from someone who's supposed to be alarmed right now. I'm not shocked this happened. What I'm actually irritated by is watching people act like it's a mystery. It isn't. It's a math problem that's been running in public for 70 years, and the state kept doing the exact thing that guarantees the outcome everyone now claims to be surprised by. Let me be precise here, because the details matter more than the outrage. Here's the part that gets skipped in most coverage of this. Kansas doesn't manage groundwater like it's a limited, non-renewing resource. It manages it like it's a river. That sounds like a small legal technicality. It is not. Rivers refill. A river you overdraw this year can, in theory, come back next spring with snowmelt and rain. The Ogallala doesn't work that way. Not in western Kansas. In a lot of that region, the recharge rate is close to negligible. We're talking fractions of an inch a year in places, sometimes less, depending on the exact soil and geology, and I'd want to verify current figures for any specific county before I put a hard number on it. But the general shape of it isn't in dispute. This aquifer built up its water over thousands of years, during a much wetter climate at the end of the last ice age, and it is being pumped down on a time scale of decades. You cannot borrow against a savings account that isn't being refilled and act shocked when the balance hits zero. The water is going to behave like water. It doesn't care how the press release is worded. So why does Kansas water law treat it like a renewable resource? Because the legal framework, built out of the Kansas Water Appropriation Act from the 1940s, later layered with the Groundwater Management District Act in the 1970s, was written using the same first in time, first in right doctrine that's been used for surface water rights across the West for over a century. That doctrine makes sense for a river. Whoever got there first gets first claim, and the system theoretically self-corrects because the water keeps flowing. Apply that same doctrine to a fossil aquifer, and you've built a legal structure that has no mechanism to say, this resource is finite, so we need to ration it before it's gone. Nobody sat down in the 1940s and said, let's design a system that guarantees depletion. They just assumed unlimited water, the way most of the country did at the time, back when the plains were still being sold on the idea that the rain follows the plow. The crisis right now isn't some new failure. It's that original assumption finally running out of runway, decades later than anyone who wrote the law will ever have to answer for. Okay, here's where I need people to slow down, because this is the part that actually explains the can't stop it headline. A water right in Kansas, once it's granted and put to beneficial use, is treated like property. Some of these rights date back to the 1960s and earlier. I've seen references to appropriation dates in that range for parts of southwest Kansas, though the exact vintage varies well by well, and I'd want the specific county records before naming an exact year for any single farm. But the structural point holds regardless of the exact date. Once you have a senior water right, the state can't simply revoke it because the aquifer is stressed. That would be treated as a taking, the same legal concept you'd invoke if the government tried to seize your land without compensation. So the no one can stop it framing that gets used in headlines isn't really about incapacity. It's about a legal structure that was built to protect prior investment, not to protect the resource itself. That's not a loophole. That's the design working exactly as written. Here's a mechanism that matters more than people think, and it's not complicated. When you pump a well, you're not just pulling water out of a fixed pipe. You're pulling water out of the surrounding sand and gravel, and that creates a lowered zone around the well called a cone of depression. Pump one well hard enough, long enough, and that cone spreads out and starts overlapping with your neighbor's cone. Pump an entire county's worth of wells for 70 years, and those cones stop being separate events. They merge into one long regional decline. That's why this isn't really a story about individual wells failing one at a time. It's a story about an entire underground system being drawn down together at a scale that no single farmer, no single well permit was ever designed to account for on its own. Now here's a reversal that I think people miss completely. Kansas isn't just draining its own water supply in isolation. The Ogallala is one continuous underground system stretching from South Dakota down through Texas, sitting under 8 states like one long shared bathtub. Nebraska sits on a much thicker, better recharged portion of that same aquifer, partly because of sandier soil that lets more surface water percolate down. Kansas, especially the southwestern counties, sits on a thinner slice with less saturated thickness to begin with, meaning less cushion before wells start failing outright. So Kansas isn't just pumping fast. It's pumping fast in the part of the aquifer that had the least room for error from the start. That's not bad luck. That's a hydrogeology problem stacked directly on top of a legal problem. And stacking those two things together is what turns a slow decline into a countdown. And this is where the "we didn't know" defense falls apart completely, because I keep seeing coverage frame this like some kind of recent discovery. It isn't. The Kansas Geological Survey has run an annual water level measurement program on wells across this region going back decades, into the mid-20th century in some form, with the modern systematic network solidifying over the following decades. I'd want the exact founding year pinned down before I stated it on camera, but the practical reality is this. There are decades of published public decline curves, the kind of chart you could pull up right now showing the water table falling year after year after year. Multiple state water planning efforts, task forces, and governor-level water initiatives over the years have looked at this exact data and proposed reductions. None of that turned into a binding statewide mandate. So when someone says the state didn't realize how bad it had gotten, that's not actually available as a defense. The paper trail proves the opposite. They knew. They renew. They knew again in the next decade's report, and probably held a meeting about it in a building with the same water-stained ceiling tiles. And still, the default legal position stayed the same. So who actually manages this on the ground? Kansas splits the state into 5 groundwater management districts, GMD 1 through 5, each covering a chunk of the aquifer region. These districts have real authority to impose local rules. And this is important because it means the tools to slow depletion do exist inside current law. This isn't a story about a state with no options. It's a story about a state with options it mostly declines to use. The problem is, who's sitting on the boards making those decisions? These are largely locally elected bodies made up heavily of the same irrigators whose pumping is the thing that would need to be restricted. That's not corruption. And I want to be careful here, because it's not some backroom scheme. It's just an obvious structural conflict. Ask the people who benefit most from the status quo to vote on restricting the status quo, and you get exactly the pace of change you'd expect. Slow, incremental, mostly voluntary, and always framed as more study needed. Which brings me to the one real experiment that actually worked. And this is the part that annoys me the most, because it proves the whole impossible to fix narrative is wrong. Sheridan County ran a pilot program, the Local Enhanced Management Area, or LEMA, where irrigators in that district voted to accept mandatory pumping reductions for themselves locally around the early 2010s. I've seen 2013 referenced as the approval year, though I would verify the exact date before stating it as fact. The result mattered. Water level declines in that management area slowed measurably compared to surrounding unrestricted areas. That's proof. Real, on-the-ground proof that if you actually cap pumping, the decline curve bends. It is not a mystery how to slow this down. Sheridan County did it, with the same farmers, the same crops, the same wells, just under a different rule. Here's the twist nobody talks about with that success story, though. Instead of that pilot becoming the template that gets rolled out statewide as a mandatory program, it's mostly been used as an example that voluntary, locally approved action can work, which quietly gets used as the argument against forcing anything on districts that don't want it. A proof of concept for mandatory reduction got repackaged into an argument for staying voluntary everywhere else. That's a very diplomatic way to say the plan did not answer the real question. That's not a technical failure. That's a communications failure dressed up as a policy success. And it's the kind of thing that sounds harmless in a press release until you realize it's basically the entire case. Now let's talk about why the water is being pumped this hard in the first place. Because the technology itself isn't the villain, even though it gets treated like one in a lot of coverage. Center pivot irrigation, those big rotating arms you see from an airplane creating green circles across brown land, is legitimate, efficient engineering. It applies water more precisely than old flood irrigation, and on its own, it's a genuine improvement. The problem isn't the machine. The problem is what the machine made possible. Irrigating marginal, sandy land that was never naturally suited to row crops like corn without heavy groundwater support. This is the technology fit question I always come back to. Ask what problem a technology was actually solving and whether the site was ever a good match for it. Center pivot systems were built to move water efficiently. They were never built to ask whether the land underneath them should be growing a thirsty crop over a non-renewing aquifer in the first place. Corn is a thirsty crop, full stop. And the economics around it, commodity corn markets, cattle feed demand, ethanol production, and federal crop insurance structures that reduce the financial risk of planting water-intensive crops even in a declining water zone, all stack in the same direction. Pump more, plant more, worry about the aquifer later. I'd want to verify the specific insurance program mechanism someone wants to cite by name, but the general incentive structure isn't controversial. The system rewards maximum current year yield. It does not reward long-term aquifer math, and no amount of efficient sprinkler engineering fixes an incentive problem sitting one layer above it. So here's a mismatch that I think is the real heart of this story, and it's the kind of thing that sounds like a boring technical detail until you actually sit with it. You've got a legitimate irrigation technology, applied to marginal land, that shouldn't be row cropped this intensively without groundwater support, financially incentivized by programs built around annual risk instead of decadal depletion, governed by a legal doctrine that assumes the source refills like a river, enforced by local boards made up of the people being asked to restrict themselves. Every individual piece of that system is defensible on its own. Stack them together, and you get a machine that produces depletion as its output, by design, whether or not any single person involved wants that outcome. Nobody has to be a villain for the machine to run exactly like this. And I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about villainous farmers. Most of the people pumping this water are making individually rational decisions inside a system that rewards exactly what they're doing. If you're a farmer with a senior water right, and your neighbor's rights let them pump at full volume, cutting your own use voluntarily doesn't save the aquifer. It just moves your water into your neighbor's crop, and now you've taken a financial hit for a decline curve that didn't even change. That's the textbook definition of a tragedy of the commons, and it's genuinely hard to solve without some kind of coordinated, binding limit, because unilateral restraint just gets absorbed by everyone else's pumping. Now here's where the monitoring piece gets genuinely uncomfortable, because I don't want people to think Kansas has bad data. It doesn't. The annual water level measurement network is actually pretty good, comparatively, especially next to a lot of the contaminated lake and drinking water stories I usually end up covering, where half the problem is that nobody was even testing. That's what makes this worse, not better. This isn't a story like a lake with no sensors where officials can plausibly claim ignorance. Kansas has the numbers. What it doesn't have is an automatic linkage between the data shows stress and pumping gets legally capped. Knowing the water level is falling doesn't trigger anything by itself. A senior water right holder can generally keep pumping their full permitted amount regardless of current aquifer stress, unless the district specifically steps in and imposes a restriction, which, as we just went through, is politically difficult by design. So the monitoring gap here isn't about missing measurements. It's about the missing enforcement bridge between measurement and action. That's a more disturbing failure than a data gap, honestly, because it means the excuse, "we didn't have enough information," was never available. They had the information. They had it in triplicate. They just didn't build a system that could act on it fast enough to matter. And that gap between knowing and acting is where I'd start asking annoying questions if I were sitting in one of those district board meetings. There's also a difference worth naming between the kind of monitoring Kansas actually runs and the kind of monitoring people assume exists when they hear the state tracks this closely. A lot of that measurement network is manual, seasonal, once-a-year readings taken from observation wells, not continuous real-time telemetry feeding a dashboard somewhere. That's not a criticism of the surveyors doing the work. It's a genuinely useful, long-running data set, but it means the system is built to tell you, accurately, how bad last year was. It's not built to trigger anything the moment a district crosses a dangerous threshold. By the time a year's worth of readings gets compiled, analyzed, and published, the pumping season that mattered is already over. You're always looking at the accident report after the crash, not the dashboard warning light during the drive. Let's talk stakes for a second, because it's easy to let this turn into an abstract policy conversation about doctrine and districts, and that's not what this actually is on the ground. Whole towns in western Kansas are economically dependent on irrigated corn tied directly to this aquifer. Feedlots, ethanol plants, grain elevators, county tax bases that would look very different on a spreadsheet without that water. When a well stops producing enough to run a pivot, that's not a spreadsheet problem. That's a farm family looking at whether the operation survives the next decade, standing next to a pivot arm that's now only good for irrigating half the field it used to cover. Some of these families hold water rights that go back generations, and forcing sudden, sharp cuts on them isn't some clean, easy fix. It has real economic consequences for real people who didn't design this legal system. They just inherited it and kept farming inside it because it was the system they were handed. And further down the line, as the water table keeps dropping in the most stressed counties, this eventually isn't only an irrigation story. Domestic and municipal wells in some rural areas draw from the same declining aquifer, and there are ecological stakes too. The playa wetlands scattered across the high plains that depend on shallow groundwater and support migratory bird populations are part of the same connected system. That's a slower moving stake, but it's a real one, and it doesn't show up in a quarterly corn yield report. And there's a longer historical echo here that I don't think gets said out loud enough. This is the same general stretch of the country that lived through the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, when a different kind of overuse of this land, dryland plowing without irrigation, stripped away topsoil and turned the sky brown for days at a time. The irrigation boom that followed, the one built on center pivots and Ogallala groundwater, was partly sold as the fix for exactly that kind of collapse. Water the ground, stop the dust, stabilize the farms, which means the current depletion isn't a totally separate story from that earlier disaster. It's arguably the next chapter of the same underlying problem, using a different resource to paper over a fragile relationship between this land and the water it needs to stay productive. So what would a professional groundwater manager actually do differently here if they were starting from scratch instead of inheriting a 100-year-old legal framework? You'd treat a non-renewing aquifer the way you'd treat a mined resource, not a renewable one, meaning you'd build an extraction plan with an actual end state in mind, phase down irrigated acreage deliberately over time, tie water rights to enforceable volume caps instead of treating them as untouchable property, regardless of current conditions, and give local management districts real teeth instead of asking the regulated parties to regulate themselves. Other groundwater systems, including parts of Texas overlying the same broader Ogallala formation, have experimented with different regulatory approaches, some tighter, some looser. I'd want the specific comparative regulations verified before naming exact program details, but the point is there's a real spectrum of options here, and Kansas isn't at the strict end of it. Kansas has mostly stayed at the voluntary end of that spectrum decade after decade, while its own data kept showing the same trend line heading in the same direction. And look, I know the instinct here is to want a villain, a bad contractor, a corrupt official, a cover-up with a paper trail somebody tried to bury. That's not really what this is, and I think that's actually the scarier version of the story, not the less scary one. There's no single bad actor to point at. There's a legal doctrine from the 1940s that made a reasonable assumption for the technology and climate understanding of its time, a set of local governance structures that put the fox in charge of the henhouse in a completely unremarkable, bureaucratically normal way, a national agricultural economy that rewards short-term yield over long-term resource math, and 70 years of published data that never got converted into binding action because no individual link in that chain had the authority or the incentive to be the one that finally said, stop. That's not a conspiracy. That's just what happens when every single actor in a system is behaving reasonably inside their own incentives, and nobody owns the whole picture. And that is precisely why this kind of failure is so hard to fix through outrage alone. That's the thesis, and I want to land it clean. This was never a scientific mystery. Nobody needs a new study to tell Kansas the Ogallala is dropping in the southwest part of the state. The decline curves have been sitting in public reports for generations, gathering dust in the same filing cabinets as the task force recommendations that reference them. The actual failure here is that a state can watch a non-renewable resource decline for 70 straight years, keep the data, keep publishing the data, keep running task forces about the data, and still not build a legal system capable of acting on its own evidence in time. Cosmetic reform instead of a real management plan. Public reassurance instead of binding caps. Voluntary pilots celebrated as proof that mandatory action isn't needed, instead of proof that it works. This does not prove anyone acted in bad faith. I am saying the timeline deserves scrutiny, because 70 years is not a short runway, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. And here's the image I want you to sit with, because it's the one that actually matters after all of this. The wells out there are still drilled to the same depth they always were. The crop insurance still rewards the same acreage it always has. The water rights on the books are exactly as senior, exactly as untouchable, as they were last year and the year before that. And the aquifer is still dropping. I won't give you a precise current annual figure without pulling the latest Kansas Geological Survey release, because that number moves year to year and deserves to be checked before it's stated as fact. But the direction of that line has not changed in decades. The sun is not going anywhere. The corn is not going to get less thirsty. The paperwork that could actually slow this down is sitting on a shelf somewhere in Topeka, completely legal, completely unused, waiting on a political will that 100 years of the exact same water law was never designed to produce.